Good evening. I'm Martha Sagowski.
And I'm Greg Warmuth. Researchers found wages in all income brackets are growing faster than they did before the pandemic as a labor shortage and inflation take a hit on businesses. Channel 9's Nick Pampantonis live in Orlando working on this story for us tonight. Nick, the data shows one income bracket is coming out way ahead here.
Well, the research showed that workers at the bottom rung of the income earnings brackets, typically a lot of service workers and other people in entry-level positions, they saw wage growth faster than anybody else. The people in the C-suites, the middle class. But the research also showed that middle class, that idea that we have of it, it took another hit.
Working in a kitchen doesn't compare to being in a corner office, but in Orlando and other cities, the two are a little closer together. Since the pandemic started, researchers at ADP found workers in the bottom income brackets have seen their wages rise more than 13%, faster than any other income level.
There's been a dramatic shift, probably owing to the pandemic. They basically saw no wage growth in Orlando in the 2 years preceding the pandemic, 2017 versus 19.
That's right. Wages were flat, then they spiked. But it didn't happen in even pricier places like New York. Economist Issy Romem helped lead the team that looked into these numbers and thinks it's because conditions in some cities allowed more people to retire early, forcing businesses to compete for fewer workers.
It's easier to get by without that extra pay. Your costs are lower. And the benefit of actually going back to work is not generally as good, so you're giving up less by not doing that.
But Romem's team found Orlando's wage growth lagged behind Florida's other three major cities.
I think the biggest difference for us is that we have a larger service industry where a third of our jobs sit. And so those wages are going to look different and show up differently in the data. Whereas you may be looking at Jacksonville that may have more financial industry.
CareerSource Central Florida leaders say the report fell in line with what they've seen, including job postings with 10% higher wages than last year. So far, they told us businesses have figured out how to make their increased labor costs work. But there was one other thing in the data that stood out. In many cities, including Orlando, middle-class workers were sort of left behind. That could be a warning sign.
What is that middle really going to look like? And how far can it stretch? Because the report was interesting because you've got these two polar opposites with the middle being stretched pretty far.
You're not building enough housing. Housing's getting expensive. Life is becoming extremely difficult for low-wage earners. Florida hasn't had that problem yet to the same extreme, but it is probably in its future.
And so Nick joins us again live. Nick, those two experts said the same thing when you asked them how we can keep the divide between the rich and poor from getting too wide, right?
Well, they both told me that job and skills training is going to be especially critical as we try and navigate that growing divide, at least nationally. You also heard him talk about housing there for a second, and he said Florida's policies at this point just aren't adequate enough to keep up with the growing demand for housing that we're seeing, especially as this crunch continues for years to come. Live in Orlando, Nick Pampantonis, WFTV, tonight.